All right, what's good with it, boys? What you just watched there, not the most exciting thing in the world, just a 455 pin press from earlier today. Just having some fun with those, getting back into some benching. Before you yell at me, Freaky D, I know I probably should have held that on the pins a little longer, dissipate any kind of elastic tension that might be stored in the pecs to make it a true low pin press. I was just rushing it for no good reason at all. But getting back into those, I get to run a nice simple progression scheme on those, which it's probably not something that's apt for pushing up towards all-time best strength, but in a retraining scenario, I've found it to be working pretty damn good. Hopefully the sun gets out of my eyes, but move you guys to the side here. Basically, I'm working up to a progressive top single, kind of feeling it out week to week, making sure I pace myself. So I hope that was evident in that 455. Got a lot in the tank, got many weeks to continue adding to that top single. And then of that training single for the day, for the first 4 weeks, I'm taking 75% and repping that for 3 sets, going to about RPE 7 to 8, then rack it. And then for the following 3 weeks, I'll be taking an 80% back off for 2 to 3 sets of RPE 8 to 9. And then the final 3 weeks, again, I'll be taking an 85 to 90% back off for 2 to 3 sets of about RPE 9. That's kind of the plan. It's not necessarily the most structured out. A lot of that is using my 10 years of training experience to pace out those singles, because anything where we're working off a top single and that top single isn't percentage based, one of the most common errors people will make is failing to properly pace out their singles. So they kind of top out long before they should have, instead of taking more incremental progress and leaving more for the next week at the rate they need to, right? So that's oftentimes if you throw someone without as much experience in, or maybe isn't the most mature in their training decisions, in a program that is using RPE-based top singles, they'll kind of outpace themselves on those singles for the name of kind of fueling their ego. I'm pretty familiar with these. I've benched a lot more than this, so there's not a whole lot of ego involved here. So I'm going to pace out these singles, and it's going to work pretty well in a retraining scenario here. Fun to just kind of do something different. I'm not really one to hit top singles through an entire training cycle. Often I'll include a top single in my strength phase and my peaking phase, but usually I won't in my hypertrophy phase, because I in particular am pretty good for my singles. I've always been able to lift more for a single than generally my rep work would project. So that would tell me, hey, that's something you're good at. It's not something you need to practice year round. Let's keep the goal in the hypertrophy phase, and save that economy to put in more volume work to try to get some bigger muscles, because clearly the bigger muscles tend to generally translate to a 1RM. So that was what that was today. But then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of this video. So I've been having a good day. Not the most exciting training day in the world, but a relatively productive one nonetheless. Still kind of recovering from that heavy deadlift. Hit some heavy squats yesterday, because I'm not going to go a week without squatting heavy. I've done it for 10 years. I'm not going to stop now, even if it would be smart. So pretty fried. Hit a quick little bench day, mostly just benching at this point for my own amusement to chase down that 600. I'm kind of at the point where a super non-specific movement pattern like the bench press is less helpful for my development of my overhead in strongman. Yeah, so the more advanced you get, the more your specificity needs to rise. Early on, we're trying to develop this general physical musculature, so a little bit more variety in our movements. They're all going to have carryover. Nowadays, I think I'm probably far past that point of diminishing returns on the bench press carrying over to overhead. I probably need to do things that more closely mirror the goal. But that being said, I'm benching because it's my hobby, and I want to get 600 before I kind of drop that back to the point that it's useful. I'm doing more than the point that it's useful, doing the point to drive up my already pretty high level bench press. And we're going to gradually chase down that 600 because it's on my to-do list. And whether it's good for my strongman or not, I like bench pressing. So we're going to keep that day in there with the primary focus of increasing my bench press. But having some fun talking to some of my clients. I was like, you know what, I'm hankering to talk about some training today. I want to talk some nuts and bolts, because that's one of my big pet peeves on YouTube. Nothing against anyone, is that many channels related to lifting center more around the personality of the person rather than the nuts and bolts of the training. And when you're a true thoroughbred meathead like myself, I want to hear about, I don't care what your motivation to lift is. I want to hear what your plan to get better is. I want to compare it to my plan. I want you to hear you talk about why it's unique to you. I really enjoyed the Dan Green podcast on on Pete Rubish's channel recently, because you can tell Dan isn't too interested in talking about himself. He wants to talk about training, because you can tell that's something he puts a tremendous amount of thought into. He's got his own unique theories on it. And so he would just went in and in on all the questions related to his own training methodologies. He gave these long ass answers, and then like, what was the best part of your powerlifting career? He'd just be like, probably this, and then just move on. I really enjoyed that. That's my kind of guy right there. So I've been hankering to talk some nuts and bolts training. I went on the channel Discord into the video ideas discussion kind of board on there, and I was like, what do you guys want to learn about? What are you guys struggling with? What do you need some help with in your goals to get stronger? Because if it doesn't come through, I'm quite passionate about getting stronger. I think it's pretty cool, and so I've kind of made it my mission to make my living helping people get stronger. So I was like, what do you guys kind of want some general help with? And one of the first ones that came up was increasing the deadlift, kind of a goal that's shared among many, if not most, strength enthusiasts as just this general proxy for how strong you are. So we're going to get into some nuts and bolts. I think Bromley actually made one of these the other day. I promise I'm not copying you. The Discord came up with it, not me. So we're going to go kind of bottom up on this. That being said, we're probably not going to spend too much time on the really entry-level stuff because there are probably really good resources out there. If you just don't know how to deadlift, there are a lot of really good tutorials that some very good lifters have put a lot of time and thought into. And if I did that half-heartedly, it would just be a worse result. I'd probably recommend you go watch theirs. But kind of going ground up, if you're newer to the gym, two of the things you're going to have to learn early on is one is how to brace. Tons of good tutorials. You're probably going to want to watch a lot of those tutorials because people are going to use different phrasings. And there is no one correct phrasing. You're not searching for the good video and all the other ones are bad. You're searching for the phrasing that's going to click with you. Bracing, especially compared to things we do in real life, is this relatively abstract content, like this abstract idea. In its phrasing, and people will be like, okay, I get it, but I can't do it. And that's why we need to go through and watch a bunch of different videos and a bunch of different people's phrasings on how to achieve a good brace. And one of them, you're like, oh, that makes sense with how I think about things. I'm going to make sure I'm diligent about every session. Every time I pick up a bar, I'm going to practice that, right? Because bracing is a skill like anything else. And we only have a limited number of opportunities to practice that skill in all of our squats, our deadlifts, all of our axially loaded stuff. We have an opportunity. And it'd be a shame just because it's light to not use that opportunity. Some people promote bracing practice, but usually what I tell people is, hey, let's take advantage of all of the practice that's built into our program via all of our working sets and all of our warm-ups first. Let's make sure we're diligent about using every single one of those as a practice for our bracing mechanic before we start doing extra bracing on top of that. Let's just use what we got, and then if you need more, we can do dedicated bracing practice drills. But first and foremost, let's learn how to kind of pressurize that canister, kind of get tight through the abs like we're going to take a punch. Whatever phrasing you like, that's something we're going to want to invest in early. You can actually get pretty goddamn strong without learning to brace. I don't recommend it, but you could do it. And then down the line, it's going to be harder to learn it because you've ingrained so many repetitions of probably the wrong setup and motor pattern. So get on that early. If you identify that as a deficit within your training, make sure it's something each session you're like, okay, I'm here to get stronger at the deadlift, and I'm also here to get better at bracing. And the other thing that you need to get good at early on is get very comfortable with a pure hip hinge mechanic, which is something that's not called upon purely in sports. Obviously, there is a hip hinge involved in a ton of athletic movements, but we're not being asked to do this pure hip hinging motion. So it's something that people are not familiar with coming in, and it's going to be absolutely essential to getting stronger. It's kind of a foundational strength training movement. So things like deadlifts, things like especially RDLs and stiff legs, where we're really isolating that hip hinged mechanic, and we're kind of taking that leg drive out of it, whether it's from the top down or the bottom up, which is kind of how I differentiate between an RDL and a stiff leg. Is one of those is dead stop from the bottom up. One of those is kind of touch and go from the top down, if we touch the ground at all. Can be a way to really develop that hip hinge pattern. Something like a cable pull through can be a very low scale way to start getting someone introduced to this idea of reaching their hips back in this hip hinging fashion. And then something like a kettlebell swing can also be another good teaching tool to help someone establish that good hip hinge pattern. So let's say we're new to getting into this. It's kind of two things we really want to get invested in early is getting strong and comfortable. Oh, and back extensions. I can't believe I forgot those. Back extensions where we're not rounding as much. We're kind of maintaining a neutral-ish posture. However, we're going to going to want to define neutral, are all ways to kind of reinforce that hinge pattern on top of the actual specific practice we're getting on the deadlift. Again, I've talked about this many times. Across our career, our specificity is going to rise, but early on in our training career, we're just trying to put on muscle. We are trying to practice and get good at these main lifts, but we also have the training economy and can benefit from all these other things. We're going to see more carryover from these more general movement patterns when we're earlier on, and we really should take advantage of that. So early on, we're trying to get our brace down, and we're trying to establish a good control of a hip hinged pattern and start building up some strength there, building up some strength in a lengthened position of the hamstrings. You'll see when someone's new to training, they go to reach forward, they just don't have this ability to lengthen through the hamstrings, so instinctively they round at the back because they, in day-to-day life, they're using their spinal erectors a good bit. They've got some confidence in the strength of their spinal erectors, so they feel comfortable getting that range of motion and moving that weight via the spinal erectors because they haven't really been strengthening a lengthened position for the hamstrings. And so that's something we want to invest in early. Just a cool little thing to talk about before we move on. So I mentioned this idea of like rising specificity. I've mentioned the point that I'm probably a bit past that point of diminishing returns for the utility of the bench press for becoming a better overhead presser. And I've also kind of mentioned that earlier on in our deadlift training, we could have this greater variety of our training. We could see a lot of benefit from it. There was this guy, I'm going to butcher the name a little bit, Anatoly Vanderchuk, who was the head of the throwing department at the Soviet Union, right? I believe he coached hammer throws, or he was a hammer thrower himself, and he established these very interesting ratios where he was like, okay, an increase in the front squat for a mid to high level hammer thrower is going to correlate with increasing their throws distance by X%. And basically, the higher the level the athlete, the less that's going to correlate. Right, so for a lower level athlete with this lower level technical threshold, increasing the front squat is going to yield this large return in terms of their distance thrown. As they get better and better and the required specificity gets better, we're going to see less direct returns from this general movement. And we're going to see good returns from a highly specific special strength exercise, something like throwing an overweight hammer, for example, right, which is it's a strength training motion. It's going to not be the competition motion verbatim, but the specificity is quite high to it. And then they're going to see a greater transfer from that much more specific movement. And to me, that's something we want to take advantage of through our career. Early on, we're going to train with this greater variety of movements, build the body from a lot of angles, because we are still able to see a lot of transfer from movements that aren't the exact thing we're trying to get better at. Because trust me, I'm a little further down the line now. That's a lot more fun when you can be like, my RDL is going to 1-to-1 carry over to my deadlift. My close grip's going to 1-to-1 carry over to my bench press. Whereas nowadays, if I want to get better at bench pressing, goddamn, it's mostly bench pressing I got to do. And I think that taking advantage of that early on builds this wider base and leads to greater success in the long run than leaning into ultra high specificity right off the bat, at least in my opinion. I probably botched some of that throwing stuff. I was never a thrower myself. Max was. But I do like reading up on as much of the Soviet methodologies and studies as I can, because it's one of the few resources we have that's observational studies on a lot of high-performing athletes with direct insight into their training. It's a very unique high-level perspective that we lack kind of in nothing but English texts. So finding translations of those can be very helpful for a young strength coach trying to gain a better understanding of periodization and preparation for a physical event, right? Something like track and field, where we are trying to perform a reasonably high skill motion, but it's not as high skill as more dynamic field sports, where we have more general physical qualities are going to predict the good sprinter and the good thrower a little bit more than maybe some other sports, how to peak them and prepare for them for a competition and what things look like further away. So that's something many of you could look into. But as promised, we're not going to harp on the lower level stuff because that's already out there in very high quality for people to find. We're going to move up into more intermediate. Let's say most of you guys watching are probably intermediates. If you found my little channel, you're that invested in your lifting, there's a reasonable chance that you've comfortably made your way into that intermediate range, however the hell you want to define that. What should we be doing to get our deadlift better? Well, I would like you to probably be challenging your deadlift 1.5 to 2 times a week. I would say for the average trainee, that can be recovered from. They don't need to have elite genetics. They don't need to have favorable leverages, and they don't need to have very high level variable management, meaning like sleep is wildly consistent, food is dialed in, hydration is dialed in, life stressors are managed well. You don't need to do that to be able to challenge the deadlift in some capacity between 1.5 and 2. And what do I mean by 1.5? I mean something that's pretty self-limiting like an RDL, where, yeah, it's got deadlift in the name. It's a Romanian deadlift. It is a deadlift, you're deadlifting twice a week, but we have this heavy reduction in load. So I think most people for a period of time would probably be best suited doing pulls from the floor once a week and doing RDLs on a secondary session. Maybe on your primary squat day is probably where most people would put that. Though you could front load your fatigue and do your heavy squats and your heavy deadlifts together, let's say on Monday, and then do your self-limiting variation, let's say pause squats and RDLs. That way we can front load the fatigue in the week, and that way we have a greater amount of time to recover between those heavy ones. Some people like splitting their fatigue more evenly and having a primary day and a primary day. Some people like doubling up and giving themselves a little bit more time between those difficult bouts. Yes, that one training session is going to be very difficult, but we have a greater amount of time between either our heavy deadlift or our heavy squat and the next time we do that really heavy movement. So some personal preference there, but I think most people would be pretty good served pulling from the floor on one session, RDLing for another session until they get quite good at the RDLs. They have this very well-established hip hinge pattern, and then most often I will have them transition from RDLs to stiff legs. I find that when people try to jump straight into dead stop stiff legs, they just don't have as good of a control as their hip hinge as they probably would need to do them very cleanly, and I'd rather they learn through the RDL. We have the negative pulling us into this nice position, and we're not overcoming the dead stop. And then as they get a little bit more advanced and they're able to lock in that slightly more extended position, leave the hips high, lift the weight through this pure hip hinge pattern, we kind of move to maybe the slightly more advanced option in the dead stop stiff leg, because overall, it's probably a little bit more useful for developing our deadlift, because something about the deadlift that is rather unique is that it's dead on the ground. We don't get a stretch shortening cycle. We have to overcome a dead weight. So eventually, moving the RDL to a stiff leg where we do have to overcome a dead weight over and over, we're challenging that skill that's very specific to the deadlift a little bit more often per week, which generally is going to be helpful. I still recommend controlling your negatives on your stiff legs because, the lengthening part of the movement, the eccentric, is probably the part that builds a hell of a lot more muscle than the concentric. It's more or less a fact. So we don't want to miss out on that part of the movement. We don't want to lose out on our ability to control the negative. But that being said, I would return to a dead stop and overcome that dead stop again once the lifter is competent at doing so. So once they get good at RDLs, I usually will graduate people over to a stiff leg. And I would say those are kind of the best friend of the conventional deadlifter is RDLs and stiff legs on our secondary day. We're pulling from the floor on our primary day. You can pull with a pause right off the floor. We can pull with a pause at the knee, or we can do the lift uninterrupted. We'll move on to the next segment. So we probably don't need to be pushing our RDLs or our stiff legs into like peaking style rep ranges. Usually I will keep those anywhere from about 4 to 12 reps, 5 to 12, 4 to 12, something like that. If we are entering a peaking phase on that secondary session, we always have the option of, okay, cool. I've run through my first 6-7 weeks of this training program. I've been building up lots of tough sets in that 5 to 12 range on my stiff legs. My hamstrings have gotten stronger. My low back has gotten stronger. My lats have gotten stronger from the exaggerated task of trying to not let that weight swing too far forward. I feel like I've built a lot of general qualities. I'm now entering the last 3 weeks of my training program, and now my goal isn't necessarily to build much more muscle or general physical strength. I'm trying to make that 6 weeks of work I did prior, I really would like that to translate to a 1RM. So what we can do is when we enter the final 3 weeks of our training block, we can switch over our secondary deadlift to a technique-focused session where, let's say, we are pulling between 4 and 10 sets of probably singles. That way we're practicing our setup that much more, right? Because lots of people will find, yada, 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 they'll find their second rep looks a lot better because they had the negative to pull them into the perfect start position. So usually athletes like that, where their second rep is routinely better, they need to use a protocol where they're practicing more first reps and they can kind of find that ideal position more reliably on the first rep. So things like EMOM work can be helpful. So maybe first 6-7 weeks, we're doing these RDLs or stiff legs, building volume in that 5 to 8, 5 to 12 range, who really cares? And then at the last minute, we switch those over to technical pulls, anywhere from 50 to 75%, doing them for singles. You can put them on a timer if you want to get them done quick. You don't have to do them on a timer, but we're getting in these we're getting in a good number of first reps, and that's going to leave us in a state where we're very prepared to find that position and execute, even when we're nervous when it comes to that heavy pull. And the fatigue from these lighter singles is going to be negligible. So for the final 3 weeks, we're going to be coming in a little bit more fresh to the primary deadlift session, rather than kind of being under this constant level of fatigue when we're doing RDL stiff legs on this day and deadlifts on this day. So that would be one transition we could make. And then the other thing we could look at is on our session from the floor, maybe we have a certain number of sets normal, and then we could do some sets from a deficit if we need to get comfortable in a slightly more rounded over position. If you're someone who their back needs to stay like almost exaggeratedly flat, and the second it rounds a little bit, they give up and they can't pull it, and they're weak. As soon as there's a slightest bit of flexion, something like a deficit where we're getting down into a more compromised position can be helpful. If you're someone who is over reliant on rounding your back, something like a elevated height pull, because you're really explosive off the floor and you got this sticky lockout. Taking away that momentum off the floor can be a challenging variation for you. So we could do some sets from the floor, and then we could do some back off sets from a altered height, whether that be down or up. We could also do some pulls from the floor, and then some halting pulls where we pull, let's say we know we lose our position right off the floor, and that's why our lockout's sticky. We could do back offs with a pause right off the floor and challenge our ability to fight and maintain that position. Pull through to a smooth lockout. If we find that where we're losing our positioning is actually as the bar passes the knee, we can do top set from the floor traditional, and then do some pauses below the knee. So there's a lot of things we can do that keep it fairly close to our vanilla movement pattern. That's what we want to be good at, that are going to let us highlight certain technical elements and certain skills, as well as certain strengths that are going to better prepare us for a max. So that's something you can exercise a lot of kind of creativity on. We're probably going to want to start our training cycle around 60%. We're probably going to want, hopefully, end our training cycle around 101%. We can kind of bridge that in anywhere from 3 to 5% jumps per week. The number of sets is going to be higher at the beginning, and it's going to come down as the weights get heavier, probably. And we can kind of come up with a creative combination of the specific exercise we're trying to get better at, and then specific variations that are going to highlight where we feel we need to gain a better mastery of the lift, whether that is a mastery of strength in a specific position by spending more time there, or a mastery of the lift in terms of, man, this muscle's weak as shit as it pertains to this lift. I'm going to pick a variation that really taxes the hell out of it. And then the last thing we're going to touch on is assistance work. Assistance work is very important. I talked about this actually in my last video, about how after we do our main work, we've got our secondary day and our primary day. We're building general qualities up until last minute, and then we transfer over to technical quality, blah, blah, blah. We then probably want to run through a little workout where we ask the question, hey, someone who's a good bench presser, what muscles are big on them? Let me do some bodybuilding work for those muscles specifically. So we're designing the workouts not necessarily with a body part in mind, or we're not breaking it up as a bodybuilder would, where we're trying to hit a certain frequency. We're basically selecting the body parts based on their relevance and function to the lift itself. So yeah, you could say, okay, after you deadlift, what is it that we want to do? A good deadlifter probably has this very developed upper back. They've got a developed lower back. They've got developed glutes, and they've got developed hamstrings. Quads are relatively important, but I usually don't find those are necessary. I mean, squatting pattern movement is pretty helpful, but I'm assuming you're already working on your squat separately. And if you are working seriously to increase your squat, we probably don't need to train that leg drive pattern to have sufficient strength in it. If we're doing full range of motion squats and we're getting stronger at those, our requisite level of kind of squat standard strength to benefit the deadlift is probably being met. So we can really focus on the backside of our body when we get into this kind of micro assistance workout. Now, assistant workouts are wildly helpful, especially early on, because the biggest difference between you and someone deadlifting more than you is the size of all of the muscles on their backside. So we damn well better be training to get those bigger. Some people underrate them and they sandbag them. And a lot of the time, the people that really are making lackluster progress, they're putting in a reasonable effort towards their main stuff, and they're putting in a really, really, really lackluster effort towards their accessories. That's one of Max's biggest pet peeves, is people complaining about their rate of progression while truly mailing in their accessories. So some people under-prioritize them because maybe they underappreciate just how much cross-sectional area is going to help you get stronger. And then some people almost overvalue them. When they initially see how much busting ass on their accessories and hypertrophying relevant muscles can do for them, they almost get lost in the sauce and think that they're even more important than the specific work itself. That's why I like to use the word assistance work. You say accessory, assistance, supplemental, all of these things. Some people have systems where each of those means a different thing, but it's kind of semantic and that's their own personal definition. It's not a formal definition regardless of what they say. I like to say assistance because it's going to amplify the work you're already doing. It doesn't replace the specific work, and doing a lot of good quality, actual specific work as much as you can handle on a reliable basis, but it's going to bolster your result even further. So if you were going to get good results, you'll get even better results if you're putting in a lot of good effort to your accessories. If you're going to get bad results, past a certain level, you can't just mail in your main stuff and have the accessories carry you home. Eventually that stops working. It's a supplemental thing to that main work. The main work needs to be taken very seriously as well. And some people will see how much the accessories can do for them early on and almost think that, oh, I just get the squatting done, so then I can just go build my legs. And that'll only take you so far. But that being said, wildly helpful. It's so helpful that people mistook it for being the main thing. So what am I looking to do after I deadlift? There's tons of different movements that can help, but I kind of break it up by movement pattern rather than by muscle group. So there are 3 main movement patterns that I like to task someone with getting better at in hypertrophy relevant rep ranges. Let's just say that's 6 to 30, probably lower than 6, but we're just going to say for accessory work, 6 to 30, kind of depending on the exercise. Sure. We're going to look at like I said, there's a lot of things we could do that are helpful supplemental movements, but there's just a couple of core things we want to do. I want to find something that's going to tax the front of our midsection, whether that be a plank, an ab rollout, a hanging leg raise, a GHD sit-up, a decline sit-up. I would like to tax something that works that front of our midsection. I find that often building up some more like muscular development of the abs increases people's ability to brace. We got more muscle. It's usually a little bit easier to contract that muscle, get tight, fill that, then pressurize that solid canister we've created. I find that packing some muscle onto the front of the abdomen is rather helpful for the deadlift. I know some people aren't bought into that, but that is my personal preference. I like to see something where we're building up the front of the core pretty robustly. I like to see some kind of rowing motion because yes, vertical pulling, you could argue it's in there. It's a great way to build up the upper back development, but strength is relatively position specific. So building all this strength in a super lengthened position of the lat is maybe a little bit less relevant to the deadlift than building up strength in this shortened position, which is where we're going to be trying to keep that deadlift in close. Our lat is in this relatively shortened contracted position. So, and the horizontal pull is going to build a little bit more of that other upper back musculature that's going to be asked to perform in the deadlift. So usually I like to see some kind of rowing motion, whether that be a pendlay row, whether that be a traditional barbell row, whether that be a Yates style row, whether that be a seated cable row, whether that be a dumbbell row. You're going to notice here, I usually try to avoid a chest-supported row because I think the extra time keeping our torso rigid, keeping our midsection braced, I think that makes the motion more helpful than just building up the upper back. We're also getting this skill transfer from the movement over to our deadlift, and that's going to make it a little bit more useful overall, is spending time on these motions that, again, we're working on this capacity of our midsection to do work. And if you're really fried from a barbell row and you really can't do it, something like a dumbbell row where we're supporting with one hand can decrease the demands on the lower back a little bit, but still really task our midsection with that anti-rotation. So I like to see a non-chest supported row, some kind of ab work, and then I like to see some kind of knee flexion, whether that be a glute ham raise, a hamstring curl, a Nordic, just some kind of knee flexion. For volume, done regularly, good way to hypertrophy, one of the primary movers of the deadlift, usually a pretty good idea. And then I like to see some kind of hip extension, whether that be a back extension, whether that be a reverse hyper, whether that be a kettlebell swing, or whether that be maybe a dumbbell RDL. An RDL, something like that. So those are kind of the main boxes I like to check after we've done our secondary deadlifts on day 1. We've done our primary deadlifts on day 2. We've got this plan of bridging from 60% to 101% on the main thing. We got this plan of hitting whatever the hell I said earlier, 4 to 12 reps on the stiff leg up until 3 weeks out, and then we transfer those over to more of some like single specific skill practice work with negligible fatigue. Cool. We've done all that good stuff. Now we're going to do an accessory workout, a supplemental workout after the deadlift day to try to build up our deadlift relevant muscles. Now, if our deadlift is lagging behind, one of my favorite things that you can do to try to help bolster the rate that it's progressing is to do your assistance work for your deadlift twice per week. So we run through this micro workout of ab, row, knee flexion, hip hinge. It could be lower scale stuff. It could just be, okay, well, I do some cable rows, I do some glute ham raises, and then I do some back extensions off the glute ham raise. So I'm using the same piece of equipment. I can do it real quick. I do those kind of round robin style in a circuit. And then I do that twice a week because my deadlift is lagging behind. That makes me suspect that my deadlift relevant musculature is lagging behind. Maybe my skill on the deadlift also needs some work, but I can do that twice a week to try to speed that up. And that's something I will often use within my own training. I actually ran through my my squat supplemental workout twice per week when I felt my squat was falling behind my deadlifting strength. And because I was doing the correct amount of the more specific work, that worked like a charm. That made my rate of progression on my squat speed up. Obviously, if I wanted my deadlift to increase, I could potentially, for a period of time, run through my deadlift supplemental work, not just once per week, but twice per week. Depending on the muscles and the motions that you're doing, you might even be able to do it 3 times a week if you really were hell-bent on bringing up a lagging lift. But those would be my thoughts. I appreciate you guys watching my channel. I like all the comments. I try to read as many of them as I can. I read through most of them, even if I can't reply to them. I appreciate you guys. I'm glad we could talk training around here.